You're not. That's your seat now.
Okay, we are good, sir. Alright, we are live whenever y'all wanna get started.
Okay, let me pull up my agenda and we can get going. Okay, it is 6:07 p.m. and we're going to call this meeting to order. First item of business is the roll call. We'll start with you, and please state your name and that you're present.
Greg Demas.
Tony Stein, present.
Michael Hall, present.
Dave Bench, present.
And Amy Rodnick, present. With that, we have a quorum. The next item of business is if there are any citizens who wish to address the commission regarding items that are not on the agenda, we can hear them at this time. I take it there are no citizens who wish to do that, so we will move right along to the consent agenda. And the first item on the consent agenda is discussion and possible action on the minutes from the May 4th P&Z meeting. I guess the proper way to do this is to have a motion and a second to approve them, and then if there's any discussion, we can do that before we take a vote. So, would somebody like to make a motion to approve these minutes? They were in your packet.
I make a motion that we approve the minutes of the May 4th Planning and Zoning Commission meeting.
All right, Dave's made the motion. Do we have a second?
I second the motion.
All right, Michael seconds. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any abstentions? Any opposed? Motion carries. The minutes are approved. Next item of business is we have minutes from the October 12th joint P&Z and City Council meeting. Those were also in your packet. Does anybody, and they were fairly extensive, so does anybody have a motion to approve those?
I make a motion to approve the October 12th Joint Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council meeting minutes.
Thank you, Dave. Do we have a second on that from somebody?
I'll second it.
All right, Tony seconds. Any further discussion on these minutes?
I have a point.
Okay.
While we were in that discussion, that meeting, or maybe just a few minutes before, I guess what was received were two email notes, one from Amy Patillo and one from Mike Rhodes. And they both contained information that I thought were very germane to the meeting. When I look at the minutes, they're not there. And I'm just curious, is how does that kind of input get recorded or captured for the purposes of planning and zoning? You know, I thought Amy's note was very good and thought that, you know, it was well thought out and probably needed to be discussed, or at least heard. And, you know, I don't see any reference to it at all in the minutes, and I just wonder why. Is that the way it normally is, or how does this work?
I would think since they were not here,
Yeah.
that probably, and I can stand to be corrected on this by council, that probably what would be appropriate if you felt that they had germane comments but were unable to be present would be to make a request that they either be made part of the minutes or read them, you know, if they're not too lengthy, or summarize them, you know, to make it part of the record.
Correct.
Is that,
Yeah, those are your options. Were they not
read into the record or made a part of it?
I don't think so.
No, they're not.
And if generally if we receive them or if they come through City Hall, so if they come to the city secretary or city administrator and we distribute them, we generally put them in the packet as well. And I guess we kind of have considered that the record, but I think generally the minutes are the official record. And so if there's another way we would like to handle that, we're open to it. But we generally try to make sure that everyone has the same information, and so it's posted in the online packet as well as given to the applicant if there's anybody here.
Well, I guess then I would ask, I wonder if everybody here in this commission has had an opportunity to read those two email notes and consider them and think, well, yes, I agree or disagree or whatever, but I would like to see more done with it. And if that means that it just be added to the minutes, that'd be great.
Yeah, I don't think we can retroactively add them, because the minutes have to reflect what occurred
Sure.
on the 12th. But I think going forward, I know I read them, they were in the packet, I'm assuming everybody else had a chance to read them. And in my experience, we don't normally put them in the record. It's more for the information of the members of the commission, to have input from residents.
Okay. Well, then
Could they be added to the minutes from that meeting now or no?
Well, I guess the question is, you had from the joint meeting, it was, like you're saying, you've got the packet, which is always the record, and it's got information in it that's not word for word put into the minutes, or if you've got comments that have been submitted and been put into the packet, that's where you can locate that information. But as far as now saying, well, we wanted that to be considered a part of the record, I guess, I'm going to say that's up to the staff
I
on
think
that.
that both of these notes came to us about 25 minutes before the meeting began. And I didn't see them until I got home. I didn't know they were there. So I'm just looking for an opportunity here to at least shine some light on them. At the very least, if the minutes of this meeting reflect that we discussed that they were there, that might be half of it.
Sure. Yeah, and also a note on process on that. It does say on our agenda packet that written comments are to be submitted up to or before 2 hours before.
Sure.
And we've always just had a practice of distributing those and maybe not really paying attention, but it does get gray then when some come in once the meeting's already started and we've, maybe not followed that as strictly. And then just also on top of that, we also don't word for word take other statements, especially even those who are here. And so I don't know if that would, cause any kind of conflict with putting then the written comments in word for word. But we're happy to at least maybe clarify all the correspondence that was received and distributed. Maybe just names who submitted those in the minutes, if that's.
Yeah, if you're going to accept, like you're saying, if you're going to accept public comments, you can also do that as well. You can identify who public comments were received from and include any of those that came in electronically for
Yes.
those who were not able to participate.
Well, just to say that
Sure.
there were comments that were made at this meeting after the meeting was effectively completed by members of the audience or whatever, and those comments were included in the minutes, which as they should, I thought. I thought that was right. I just wondered why the written comments wouldn't also have that same kind of status get included
There
somehow.
shouldn't be anything in the minutes that happened after the adjournment of the meeting.
I've been a board secretary on nonprofit boards, and served on a number of these. And normally, some folks in onboarding packets will give you information on how to be a good secretary, And these minutes were probably more he said, she said than they should have been, if anything. And that normally, I will see minutes that, brand new secretaries do, and they will go on and on and on about what somebody said and what this person said, and that's really not the purpose of minutes. Minutes are supposed to show if there was action taken. You can summarize a discussion, but you don't want to have he said this, she said that, And, so I think if anything, the minutes were, when I read them, they seemed to me to maybe be a little more detailed and longer than minutes need to be. You know, what you want to capture in minutes is action taken, you know, and have it be specific enough that that you can, you know exactly what the motion is, and the motion makes sense, you know, and obviously in what we do here, it's really important we word our motions properly, you know. But in terms of you know, I don't think we can retroactively add citizen comments, especially if they were not submitted, you know, on time. And I think that normally when people get up and talk, you know, the minutes might reflect who was there, you know, and that they expressed an opinion on something. But we have to be careful about just putting in a lot of he said, she said in the minutes, and it may be better to make reference to something and say, like, we received 10 citizen comments on this topic, and if they are posted publicly, you know, for the public to be able to access and see who made comments, that might be the best way to do it.
Sure.
But if you all have some thoughts on that.
I definitely agree with everything you said here. I think a good move forward would be to, I guess, either amend the motion to postpone the vote on these, and we can go ahead and make them a little more action item oriented and a little bit, and you know, obviously still with the same discussion, no content changing, but then they'll also need to be approved by city council anyways, so we can go ahead and pull those back, or just not vote on them here, and then we can bring them back at a future meeting. Maybe with more of that just reflection of who submitted comments and who spoke.
Yeah, and you know, it might not be a bad idea to pull some articles or something, you know, for everybody's information. Because I mean, your point is good, Dave. You know, but I think, you know, we have to know what is the appropriate thing that we put in minutes, you know, as opposed to just either in the board packets or we post on the website. And I think it is important to note somewhere, if we've had a lot of citizen input on a topic, that you know, that can be accessed.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess to clarify too, like those comments that came in shorter than 2 hours before, do those get retroactively added to the agenda for that meeting, or are they kind of lost? I guess?
Right, generally no, but because we had distributed one that came in after the deadline, that kind of blurred it. I think it came right around 2 hours and we sent it out, and then we had more that came right before, and so we just wanted to be fair with all the input. But then also we had some come in after the deadline, you know, after the meeting had started, and so I think we'll be better about that in the future of drawing a clear, you know, this is when they're accepted, and then afterwards, you know, the opportunity has passed. But so those we put them in the packet if we distributed them or shared them here. We did put them in the packet for the public. So if you guys saw them, the public saw them. We just wanted to make it.
Yeah, and I guess I mean, fortunately, I don't think we've had the problems enrolling with that some municipalities or school boards or things like that have had, where people might make really inappropriate comments, you know, that we would be not wanting to put on the website or wanting to edit, you know, in some way. And you know, I haven't had it happen to me in a long time, but I remember when I was on the council, you know, we did have some people that, back then there was no internet, but they would like show up and say, you've been bribed by the developers, and I know you've been paid $10,000 under the table to vote for them, or something like that. So we kind of have to be mindful. You know, I think it probably is a good idea to have some clear rules about how we accept comments, and that comments need to be appropriate, not threatening or inappropriate. They need to be addressed to the topic at hand. You know, I don't think we're going to have those kinds of problems here, but we still probably should make rules for it, because if we don't, then we will get somebody, you know, that will do something wacky. So, you know, that might be good, just to maybe talk to your peers, you know, in some of the other cities, and see how they address public comments. 'Cause you know, I think obviously the goal is transparency, you know, and to have as much citizen input as possible, as long as it is appropriate, you know, not meandering or on rabbit trails or whatever, you know. So it may call for some discretion on our part, you know, how we present it.
Well, I guess if we, like, as an example, if somebody sent an email right now, obviously it's not gonna be in the record for today. Should we think about having, you know, if we get something that's germane to whatever we're discussing today, should we automatically add that to the next meeting's packet, just as a, I don't know, addendum of items? Because, I mean, you gotta respect rules and timing and all that, but on the other hand, I wouldn't necessarily wanna say, well, you know, you missed the deadline,
Sure.
your feedback doesn't exist. Especially when I think we're kinda hard pressed to get citizen feedback on a lot of issues.
Right.
Wouldn't wanna miss some, so maybe we could have that added to the next one as items that were received, you know, timing of which couldn't be included in that week's packet, or that meeting's packet.
Well, I think if the idea is for all of us as members of the commission to receive public input, you know, I mean, obviously one way is if they can come down here and speak to us. That's the ideal, most ideal, you know, because then it's face to face. But if they are unable to do that and want to send us an email, then just have some reasonable rules about, you know, we'll try to get it into the packet for everybody to see it. If we don't, you know, it can roll over to the next meeting and go into the next meeting's packet, unless it's no longer germane because we took a vote and it's a done deal or
Right.
something like that. You know, so I think we'd have to give some discretion to city staff to filter some of this.
Or I suppose if we got something late and y'all wound up circulating it to us, with the next meeting, we could say we wanna add this to, you know, packet.
You can always read it into the record if we put it out there and it's important to you, so it was a late one and we put it, you can read it into the record.
Well, how do you all feel? Do we want to vote on this, or do we want to let them edit the minutes and bring them back?
Even if we do that, I think we need to make a motion, right? That's what it sounded like. We make a
Yeah,
motion to
well, we have a
amend the minutes.
motion on the floor. We have two options there. We can either go ahead and approve the minutes as written, or we can not approve them as written and then make a motion for city staff to, you know, redact the minutes a little bit and return, you know, bring them back to us
Well,
at
then
the
I'd like
next
to
meeting.
amend my motion.
Pardon?
I'd like to amend my motion.
Well, why don't we just vote, we could vote no on it if you want, and then we can make a new motion.
Okay.
Wouldn't the third option be to bring them into these minutes though, as well?
No, we just, that
Or
was
was
the
that-
topic of the discussion,
Yeah.
that we retroactively bringing in you know, information that was not part of the minutes is not, allowable.
But, okay.
You're talking about today's meeting?
Today's meeting.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's
I
what-
see
that-
what
that-
you're saying, I see what you're
Basically, if there was a
saying.
deadline of 2 hours and it came in after that deadline, then wouldn't they just be part of this meeting then? Right, so there's not a dead zone between deadlines, effectively. If you
Yeah,
missed a
yeah,
2 hour
you could-
deadline, then it goes to the next meeting.
Yeah, I suppose you
Have an
could,
agenda item for it.
yeah,
Oh, I see.
Right.
yeah, is
Fine.
the problem,
Yeah, okay.
So,
So are we looking maybe, I guess, it sounds like the conversation is these aren't necessarily action minutes. These are more like a
He said, she
transcript or
said, yeah.
transcriptional minutes, and so the direction would be to ask staff to come back with action minutes.
Right, and,
Okay.
and I'm not saying, you don't say that a discussion didn't occur.
Right.
You know, that clearly if people had discussions on certain topics, the minutes, you know, the meetings are recorded if anybody wanted to really listen to it. But I think, probably what we need to do is mainly address action items, make sure whatever motions were made, if any. You know, I don't know that any motions were really made because that was an informational meeting. And so, what I would probably do is say, let's vote no on the motion, and then, ask staff to rewrite them and bring them back to us in December.
Sure.
And then if there are any agenda items that board members want to have on the agenda, you know, because of correspondence received. And, you know, obviously the ideal thing would be the people who wrote the memos can come and talk to us, but if they can't, then, you know, we can certainly have, you know, Dave, if you say, hey, I got this, you know, email from Amy, and I think what she said is really important, and she can't be here, so I would like to read part of her memo into the record, you know. And I think, again, we all have to use discretion, you know. If Amy wrote a 20-page memo, you know, then it would be necessary to summarize it. So, does everybody feel like we have some clear guidance on this?
Staff definitely does. We're happy to bring that back next month.
Okay. All right. Anybody else have any thoughts or questions?
I think that makes sense.
Okay. All right. Well then, let's call for a vote. All in favor of the minutes, say aye. Opposed?
No.
No. All right. You want to make a new motion now?
I make a motion that we amend the minutes as written for the October 12th Joint Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council meeting to reflect that there was additional input provided via email that did not get into the record otherwise.
Is that okay?
There were several emails. So we-
Yeah.
I think-
I think.
Okay.
I think it might just be best to just ask staff to review those minutes and bring back an updated version, and we'll take everything we said here today into consideration.
Yeah.
Would you
I don't need a
withdraw your
motion on
motion?
that.
Let
I
me
Yeah.
will
make one.
withdraw that motion.
Thank you.
Do we?
I don't
I'll
think we
make a
need,
motion
I don't think
then.
we need one, if
We
we're just
don't?
directing
If we
Just,
staff.
don't
all right,
act-
yeah.
let's
The
just
motion
say
to
that it
approve
is
the
the
sale. Yeah.
consensus of the commission
Okay.
to direct staff to, you know, redact the minutes and mainly reflect actions taken.
Wonderful. We will take everything into consideration. Bring
Okay,
them back.
thank you.
Of course.
All right, well, let's move on. Okay.
We don't need to vote on that?
We don't, there's,
Okay.
we're hearing from
Okay.
legal counsel, we don't need to
No.
have a
Okay.
vote. So I will use my great powers to, make, you know, as chair to make that
I'm
instruction.
humbled.
Okay, next item, we're gonna go on to the, regular agenda now, and the next item of business is, apparently there are 3 of you whose terms are about to expire, and it's not necessarily that you're the ones who served the longest, it's just whose term you stepped into, I guess.
Right.
And so I think Greg is one of the people, Dave and,
Mike Rhodes is the third.
Mike, okay, so Mike's not here.
Sure.
And I don't know what Mike's intentions are, but for those of you whose terms are expiring, we'd love to continue to have you if you're willing to continue to serve.
Yes, it's my intent to continue to serve.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, let it be noted in the minutes. Then,
Please do.
We will absolutely.
Frankly, it was a surprise to find my name in red on this list.
well, I was kind of surprised not to find my name.
Well, and I'll give a little clarity to that. We do just have those alternating every 2 years, and it's rare that someone really rolls off after their 2 years and then someone new takes their place immediately. Normally, it's a filling of a vacancy, and so we generally have a 6-year limit. But if you come in halfway through a term, we don't hold that 1 year against you and don't let you do your 3rd full term. And of course, all of this though is subject to city council approval. So we do this item with every board and commission that we have in the city, and we bring it back to them in December, and they can generally approve the slate or possibly do some term limit extensions if there are requests for those. And so we don't want to freak anybody out by telling them their term is up and they have to go. So we just wanted to let you all know, and we'll reach out to Mike Rhodes and
All right.
get his intent via
Yeah,
email.
well,
and
let's hope Mike is willing to continue to serve as well, and then you know, hopefully we can continue with the same folks here. All right, so the next item of business is sorry, I lost my place here. Get back to the agenda. Okay. Okay, the next item on the agenda is discussion and possible action regarding residential zoning ordinances defining the minimum required depth and width of yards. And so this is continuing the discussion we had on the 12th, and we'll open it up for comments.
I'll give a brief kind of discussion on this. So both this item and the next item are the same items that were before you at the joint City Council and Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. They are not yet posted for public hearing, which is a requirement to have. If you're going to change a zoning ordinance, there must first be a public hearing by P&Z as well as City Council. There are some noticing requirements that we were not able to meet in time for this meeting. So this meeting, again, kind of further discussion. It is possible action, and I think any kind of possible action we would ask for here is direction to us on possible amendments to bring back, things you would like us to consider in bringing back any kind of possible ordinance changes for items 5 or 6. And really, we're just looking for a dialogue and a discussion. You do have in your packet for this item specifically on yards some items that came from City Council and things they have discussed, but they've sent these to you guys to give us your input and your thoughts, and then we're happy to bring back for the next meeting, which would be the December 7th meeting, a properly posted public hearing, so that way we can get public input on any changes you'd like to make. So we're just here to help kind of guide any questions you guys have or discussions you'd like to have about these yard required depth of width of yards, and then get your feedback.
Well, I guess first question I would have, what do you all consider have been the biggest problems? You know, Sarah's here, so she may have some thoughts on this as well. What do you all consider have been the biggest problems with the current ordinances with regard to these?
So regarding the yard versus setback, and so I'll kind of just go kind of directly into the first kind of most obvious issue, code language wise, which is that we don't have setbacks, the actual definition of setbacks in our residential code. Currently, it just uses the term yard. It is defined in a similar way to do have the setback effect, but I think that's one thing that would probably be helpful for staff when it comes to the discerning between what is considered a yard, just from a front yard, side yard, backyard, kind of a directional yard versus an actual setback. So that's one thing that I think staff would probably recommend is an update to make it consistent with all of our other zoning districts, which do include setbacks. And then I think other than that, as far as the actual application, I think there's been questions about cantilevering properties, what can and can't occupy what's currently that yard or setback. I think we kind of use those terms interchangeably. And so that's kind of generally what was brought to you in one of the attachments in the packet, some concerns regarding yards and setbacks. And I think that's what we've heard from City Council, and that's what we're kind of looking for direction on, because we're doing the reviews in accordance with the code, but we'd like to make sure the code is as clear and is exactly what everybody wants to see, so that our reviews match up with those. So
Okay. And I take it right now under our code, we all know, I think, what a setback is or means, or what it should mean. And obviously a setback is going to be in a yard, but then you can have yard that is not in a setback.
right.
And then the other piece you were just saying is with regards to what can actually be in a setback, right? So for example, a wall, right, a front yard wall, some people have stone walls that are a couple feet off the road, yet I would imagine that's sitting within the setback. Tractor landscape or anything like that.
Right, and sometimes there are drainage features, and there's different rules on what is or isn't allowed, and walls of certain heights, and what's not allowed as well. So.
Well, I'd still like to bring up that I'm fine with the way, what's being proposed here with regard to what is being described as a yard and how that works. I think that's fine. I just have a problem with the limitation on, I'd said before, overhangs, call it eaves, whatever you like. I just think that, it's too restrictive the way that it's written right now. And I'd like to see it broadened a bit.
In the rewrite or in the current code?
In the code.
Are you looking for like a larger area too than the 2 feet, which seems to be pretty common?
Yes, I'm looking for 4 feet, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, there was some discussion whenever we had the joint meeting with the city council that, you know, part of my argument has to do with shade and how the sun travels, you know, throughout the year and what overhangs do for a place as far as energy conservation goes. And there was a suggestion made that trees can do the same thing, and that may be true to a certain extent. So I went back and read the tree ordinance thoroughly, and boy, there's a lot in there. It does not take into account, the tree ordinance does not take into account our risk of wildfire in this area, which is by Travis County moderate. And given the kind of situation that we'd had over this past summer with things drying out the way that they did, and with the heat that we, you know, the 90 days of plus 100 degrees that we had, would it really make sense that someone would plant trees that close to their house that they would get shade through their windows? I'm not sure that it's really what you want to do. I think trees are a good thing, but you have to be judicious in how you do it, how you plant them. So, yeah, only that. I personally think that overhangs are something that just need to be written a little bit differently. And the rest of it, cantilevering and bump outs and so on, and anything else that's in a place, I think the way it's written so far, I think it's fine.
Anybody else have any thoughts?
Are those the primary concerns about overhangs? I mean, is that really what the issue is boiling down to? Or is it other things around any, you know, obviously if you just read it, it speaks of fence walls, you know,
I think the issue is that some people have said that certain spec builders or whatever may push the envelope, and if the code is not written in a way that clearly specifies that certain things aren't allowed, they're gonna do it, and then we're gonna have to
Absolutely.
react, and so we're kinda here. I feel it's like things came at us that, you know, are very legitimate, but they have to be addressed a little thoughtfully, comprehensively, and I don't know, I've spent the time on it, but, you know, I think that's kind of what's before us now, is to.
Yeah, for sure. I guess my question is, like, do we, certainly if you don't, you know, developers will come in and build whatever, right? I mean, there's no question about that. Is the concern specifically, I'm just trying to narrow in on what are some of the more
I
specific
think it's like
concerns that we have.
cantilevering
Is it-
and
okay.
height, so
Mhm.
people trying to, you know, do things that technically work because a foundation starts here,
Yep.
but then the house goes over 10 feet from there,
Mhm.
something like that.
Well, I think that the house on Park Hills sort of sparked a lot of the
Mhm.
discussion, because they
That's,
definitely, looked for every loophole in our building code that they could, so, I mean, I'm personally fine with what staff are proposing. But, Dave, when you talk about overhangs, you're not talking about people trying to cantilever something, you know, into a setback. You're talking about like roofs, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there was some, and Sarah can correct me if I'm getting it, but what city council brought forward was, you know, yard setback, whatever, you know, people are often going to, particularly spec developers are often gonna build to the edges to maximize, you know, interior square footage, and then they may extend roof, eaves, overhang, whatnot, further beyond that. And there's currently no limitation on how far that could go, so in theory, someone could build that out to the property line. So there were concerns expressed about drainage, you know, into an adjacent, property. There were also concerns about, you know, punching a, you know, living space, whether it be outdoor living space on an overhang or interior living space where the base of the foundation goes up to the setback and then maybe the structure extends out, cantilevers out further. I think I never got clarification. The one example we used on that everybody pointed to is the house on Rollingwood Drive across from the pool that has a cantilever
Oh, yeah.
living structure out, and I could never get an answer on whether the setback on that house is at the foundation line or is at the line of the living space. I think for me, clearly, you know, that's gaming the system. You know, if you want to have a cantilevered look for aesthetics or whatever, and that's fine, but the living space needs to end at the setback. And if you want to, you
Yeah.
know,
The
the
cantilever
foundation
overhang
inside,
should
right.
end at the setback. as
And I
opposed
think-
to-
Right.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody wants living space, you know, a balcony or whatever it is that is cantilevering into the setback.
Yeah,
That
I mean,
seems-
some of the cantilever architecture looks very nice, but my understanding is the one on Rollingwood Drive, actually, that cantilevering was not done within the setback because it was next to the driveway. But,
So
you know,
this-
I assume it wouldn't. I mean, the impression I got, and wasn't really comfortable with the specifics, but from the engineer who was there was that they were not likely, and Nikki may be able to help, not likely to approve a cantilevering living structure into the setback. That was my impression.
yeah,
Right, I think generally that's how they're interpreting it, is that if it's livable space, it's not currently allowed in the setback. So if it's a roof, it's different than if it's a balcony, and if it's a cantilever, it's different than it's just a wall.
but what we don't want is ambiguity, you know,
Right.
even if somebody's interpreting it that way, but there's room for another interpretation, then we want to make sure we take care of that.
Sure.
Yeah, and I personally have significant concerns about people in the, you know, whether they're inside or outside, people in the setback within their house or balcony or whatever. I have
Well,
less sensitivity about overhangs, and I can understand Dave's position, but I also think, you know, we don't want, you know, there's some limitation. We don't want, you know, a roof line extending to the fence line. So I think we just have to think how to handle that. You know, I think we've had a tendency, since I've been on, there's these, you know, kind of issue du jour that pops up, oftentimes related to a specific house or specific situation. And I want to make sure we don't kind of rush to address an example house that push the boundaries without being thoughtful about unintended consequences to the other houses that aren't,
Right.
you know, pushing the boundaries, or,
Yeah.
and maybe even more significantly as to what kind of non-conforming situations we create with our actions that have impact on people being able to rebuild if there's a fire casualty or whatever. So my thought was, and this we're here today, is discussion about thoughtful rewrites that don't have unintended consequences that we didn't discuss and think about. And I was hoping, I did it too late, but I sent out a note to some people to welcome citizen input, and Didn't
we
work.
do have one person with their hand
Okay,
raised,
good.
so we actually do have someone waiting to give some input if the chair would like to recognize them.
Certainly. Is this somebody who is on Zoom right
Yes.
now?
Hi, this is Kendra Rollison. I'm actually walking in the door, but I guess I'll talk until I get there. I haven't spent a lot of time looking at the proposed rewrite, but I just spent about 5 minutes before the meeting looking at it from my expertise, which is a real estate attorney perspective. And I guess what I tried to stress last meeting was the importance of carefully crafting language and understanding the full effect of changing the code piecemeal. Two things that just in a brief review I noticed. There's a strikeout at the top about fences being permitted in yards, and then there's nowhere else now in this section that permits a fence to be in a yard, which I think is pretty much the status of most properties in Rollingwood. So I think that's one discrepancy. The second one I noticed is that the qualified building definition includes accessory buildings. And then it talks about exceptions as it relates to qualified buildings into the yard. And then down below it says, but accessory buildings are otherwise dealt with in different portions of the code. And so I think there's another discrepancy that causes confusion, in my opinion, for our reviewers that are interpreting these code provisions that the city is implementing. And so my only, I guess, request would be that the city proceeds with caution here and just piecemeal changing code provisions. I'm not against implementing some kind of restriction as it relates to overhangs or cantilevered structures, but I think we need to go about it the right way.
Yes, and what would, I mean, I think that generally makes sense. I mean, what would be the best way? Good timing. What would be, you know, is there, having, you know, admittedly never sat on a planning and zoning commission before, is there an assessment that other cities would have, done before to, like, I mean, we don't have that many homes in the neighborhood. Would that be an insanely laborious task to be able to effectively assess the current homes against the changes to the code that we would do?
I think that would probably be a bit of
Or
work
a sample.
for a process. I think,
Yeah.
you know, maybe a sample might be
Sure.
more realistic. And I think in general, as far as like full scale, you know, potential zoning updates for the residential, there is discussion at the city council level of having kind of a review of those residential zoning codes, kind of all at once. These were sort of singled out and identified as, you know, issues that are of high importance right now and we've seen, you know, had some issues with reviewing and enforcing. And so that's why they were brought kind of singled out separately. But there is a plan to hopefully review the entire residential zoning code, hopefully in the near future.
Yeah, because like I would just use the example that you just brought up, like removing anything that allows for a fence in a front yard, right? Like that's a really big deal, right? And I would imagine that would impact a significant amount of the current homes, let alone
Sure.
anything new that's gonna be built,
Right.
right, in the neighborhood.
Absolutely. Right. And those are the kind of things that we're looking for that direction. It's like, you know, what do you or don't you want to see in those areas? And then that way we can bring back some options and things to consider. Those are key parts.
With regard to those kinds of things, is there an argument behind them? I mean, why were those ideas introduced? What offense was it that caused someone to say, well, we shouldn't do this anymore, we gotta change this?
I think city council referenced last time that that they have gotten some input from citizens about these specific issues. And that there are specific examples of it. The only one we talked about was the Park Hills one, but I think we talked about potentially bringing back some other examples as well as, I mean, I mentioned it'd be great to have the citizen feedback, which haven't seen anything specific to.
Yeah,
Sarah?
we've seen, so Sarah Hudson, City Council. We have seen instances where, like the cantilever has come in and we're talking about how far you could get and that there's no limit. And it's the builder's pushing the limit and the neighbors are feeling like they're being towered over. And so trying to put some reasonable limitations in place to protect the existing residents, and make sure that it's clear to everybody what is allowed and not allowed, and not leave it up to the discretion of anybody, lots of people making their own interpretations. And it makes it easier for the city building officials if we clarify what our intention is and what we want the definition or the interpretation to be. And so that's what we're trying to get some more clarification on.
I think I understand that pretty well, and you're right, I mean, it has been open, and, you know, there really wasn't any limitation as far as what you could drop into a setback, as long as it didn't touch the ground effectively.
Right.
Yeah, but, this more recent thing about fences in the front yard, it doesn't bother me, but but it was introduced, and it was a thing that, you know, I'm just wondering why does anybody care about that? What happened with that?
For years, there was no allowed front yard fence at all. Front yard fences were not allowed in Rollingwood. And so a number of years ago, there was a big discussion because somebody put up a front yard fence, and then it was, you know, they were being told they weren't allowed to have that, and so then there was a big discussion about what is reasonable and what do we want, and it affects the character of the neighborhood, the openness, all of that, and so there was a big effort at the Planning and Zoning Commission, big public hearing, lots of input from the residents on essentially what do we want Rollingwood to look like, right? What are the limitations? And at that time, there was a change that allowed front yard fences no more than 3 feet. I don't remember all the details, but you know, a certain distance from the front setback, you know, couldn't be right up on the fence, you know, on the street or on the property line or the right-of-way line. It had to be 80% see-through.
Yeah.
Right, so you can't put up a privacy fence in your front yard. Part of that is also safety issues from visibility when you're, especially on corners, right, when you're driving. So there was a great deal of effort put into coming up with what our current front yard fence ordinances are.
But it's being recommended that we take that away, and that.
Right.
you
That's
know,
what I was gonna say, that,
That's
you
what
know,
it says,
so there was
yeah.
a,
And I don't think
yeah.
I don't think that was the intention.
Oh.
I mean, that has not been there's
Okay.
been no discussion about taking away the limits on front yard fences, so.
I was just reading this one here in
Yeah.
107.3.1 is that, it, you know, yard means it's unoccupied, which is open and unobstructed.
But that's not doing away with fencing, it's just saying it's a definition.
Okay,
Right.
got it. So I think those are really important things, right, to clarify. Yeah, okay, got it.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's just
I don't think there was
definitional.
any
Okay.
intent to eliminate the front yard fence
Okay,
requirements.
I
of the front yard.
misunderstood, I misunderstood.
Yeah,
No, I
no, 'cause
didn't as well.
we
If
spent
it's
a
not
lot of
clear,
time
we need
on
to-
that
I'm
If
gonna
issue.
it's not
go back
clear,
and
we
look
need
at
to
it
make
again.
sure that we,
Yeah, I'm
that
gonna
we
go look at it
clarify
again.
that, so.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
spent a lot of time on that issue when that fence first
Okay.
came up, and I don't
good.
think the idea would be to just, you know.
Right.
But at one point, I think we need to kind of keep in mind, I think that people have made some very good points about, you know, we don't want to do anything hastily, we
Right.
don't, you know, we want to think through what we're doing. But sometimes you do need to put Band-Aids on things. I mean, if you don't, you know, it's gonna bleed. And so I think that, what we have to ask ourselves here is until we can have a more comprehensive rewrite of our building codes, if we have urgent issues right now, then we do need to put a Band-Aid on it.
Yeah, I guess that's one of my questions about the urgency, and I think we kind of asked about this a little bit last time, is I guess we've had this, you know, to the extent it's a problem, we've had this problem forever. There's no definition of the overhangs. So now we're saying what has changed that's led to this, you know, immediate concern is that we've seen larger houses being built. So the impact of that extension is maybe greater than it might have been before. But what I still don't have a good feel for is, in practice, what has been done. Like, I've looked at the Park Hills one, and, you know, of course, the only plans I've seen are what's on their marketing materials, and I have no idea if it's built, you know, accurately as those are drawn. But it doesn't look like they're dramatic. They're certainly not drawn to extend anywhere close to the property line. I don't know, I can't tell on the thing if it's 2 feet or 4 feet or 5 feet or whatever. I guess my question for staff is, you know, do we have specific examples of either homes that have been built or recent permits that have been pulled, you know, as to how many, you know, houses we're dealing with that extend beyond the 2 feet that's proposed in here, or if we talk about 4 feet, you know, do we have any examples of what's potentially out there and how far people are pushing the envelope? Or is the concern just that, you know, we see this being a problem with people doing it in the future? I'm wondering if it's a problem that's already happened or if it's a problem we're worried about happening.
I will say we don't have that information collected on, you know, maybe more recent ones, how many of them are, you know, kind of what extent they are doing these overhangs and things like that. Definitely something we could get a sample of, but I think what we're really hoping to find out is, you know, what do we see as the problem and what is it we're really trying to not have? You know, we don't want to go around the problem and try to, you know, target other things if there's something that we're just trying to fix, and it's just that we don't want, you know, cantilevers or what, you know, what are the things we don't want, and let's be clear about those, and then I think we can have a code written that will do that effectively. Probably not, you know, here, we probably can't dissect the code right here and figure it out, but I think we could take those larger ideas back and try to design something that achieves what you guys want to see.
Do y'all know, would there be any practical limitation right now, just based on y'all's interpretation, if somebody brings in a house that's, you know, the foundation, the conditioned space is within the allowable, you know, and then they have roof line extending beyond that by some measure, I mean, is there any attention being paid to that right now, or is there not because it's not written?
The attention is, I think, currently only paid as to whether or not it's inhabitable. And so if they're saying it's just a roof line, you know, we do kind of have to go off that in the plans. If they're not calling it a balcony or something, it would be allowed. I think we have one that's up to 4 feet. So those overhangs are up to 4 feet. And so those are okay if they're roofs the way it's currently written. But so that's as far the extent that we're reviewing it, or at least our engineers are, is whether it becomes a porch as opposed to a roof. So, but currently, no. I mean, I don't think we've probably seen one more than 4 or 5 feet. I'm assuming, 10 might raise some alarm bells, but I don't know if we would have any reason to deny that in the code, or.
4 or 5 feet on a 10-foot side setback
Sure, it's
still is,
It's a lot, yeah.
is very imposing to the next door neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
Can I say something? If you look at there was a city council meeting a few months ago where Kay Freese presented about this exact issue. I think when the Park Hills house was brought up as an example of someone abusing what's in the code right now. And the Kay Freese people, I don't have the code section in front of me, but the code already says you can't have a living space, like a habitable portion of the structure within the setback. The only part of the structure that can protrude within the setback is, the current code I think lists out like eaves, overhangs, things like that. And I think Brooke Brown thought that the interpretation of that was different from what Kay Freese was interpreting it as, which is essentially the soffit of a house, the overhang can go into the setback, but really nothing else. And so I guess my suggestion as a citizen of Rollingwood would be, until we get to the point where we have real citizen input and are doing a full rewrite of the entire residential building code and looking at how all of the different provisions relate to one another, why don't you all just consider leaving the code as is and adding a new section that says, as it relates to any protrusions within the setback, they may not extend beyond X feet. I guess from the beginning, I've been wondering, when it was presented at city council, the issue was, we want to limit protrusions into the setback. And Brooke Brown was saying 2 feet. But then she presented this code rewrite, which does a lot more stuff than that. But if the real issue is to put a Band-Aid on the immediate issue, specifically as highlighted by that Park Hills house, it seems like there's a much easier fix than going in and making all these changes when they haven't really been thought through, in my opinion.
I think that's well said. I think it's commenting, Ashley, what you were saying a bit as well. I agree with what you just said, that what is the real immediate issues that we're looking to solve? Because sitting here right now, there's no way that we're ever gonna be able to nitpick what is probably a complex code that has really material implications for a lot of stuff, whether it's existing properties or new ones. Is the protrusion of, is that where this I think there's a lot of things in play here, but is that really the issue at hand, or is it something a heck of a lot bigger than protrusions into setback space?
That's my impression of at least the start of this conversation is why we're here. That's my understanding.
Well, my understanding is that, you know, from input I've gotten from citizens is that some of them feel like there've been abuses and that developers have perhaps taken ambiguities in the code and, you know, interpreted them obviously to their benefit, and city staff may have felt, you know, they didn't have legal grounds to dispute that. And so, I don't know, I mean, it doesn't look to me like huge amounts of changes have been made with this right now. But I mean, we've heard some good points of view here today in terms of what we're trying to do. I'm sorry that Brooke was sick and couldn't be here to put forth her position on it, but you know, obviously what we need to do is say, what is the immediate problem that needs a Band-Aid? And then what do we do to address, you know, what kind of Band-Aid can we put on it until we can make more comprehensive changes in the code?
Yeah, and I would say I've talked to a lot of citizens about this as well, and the two primary issues that I've heard, I think are kind of what we're trying to capture here. One is building into setback space, and two is height. And I just wanted to make sure, is height another thing that's been brought up as a significant area of concern?
Yeah, it is the
Okay.
next item.
So I'm sorry if I
Yeah.
was jumping around items, but I mean, those are
Sure.
the two residential items that ultimately were.
Right, yeah,
Okay.
and we could pull those
Yeah.
both up to be, we could pull the next item up too if we wanted to kind of jump back and forth.
Apologies,
I
for
think
jumping.
we ought to
Sorry.
go ahead and.
Sorry,
Yeah.
yeah.
No,
Jumping.
I think we probably ought to address them
Like
in
holistically.
tandem, because we're gonna be bleeding over onto each other, not to use bleeding analogies
Or at least
here,
discuss it in
but,
tandem. Yeah.
yeah, you know, I think that it makes sense to discuss them.
Well, just as we're having the essence of the conversation right now is really, this is a complex topic. There's a lot of implications what we're talking about. What are the real issues that we can at least try to make some progress on tonight? And I think it is those two things together. Okay.
The overhangs and,
You know, I
yeah,
have a question too.
definitions.
I guess I kind of keep coming back to the same thing, but you know, we have a lot of, in the last meeting and this meeting, we have a lot of kind of vague references to citizen input and, you know, developers abusing or maybe not even abusing, you know, threading the needle, you know, interpreting loosely, whatever it is. You know, and we keep talking about this Park Hills, like, if we're going to use that as an example, how far do those eaves extend on that specific house that we keep referencing? Do we know that answer? I haven't heard that yet.
I definitely don't want to get too far into a specific property that's not posted, but I think that one was 4 feet, and so that was just one of the examples. I think 4 feet for the roofs, but they're not necessarily, they're not planned as balconies, or at least they're not stated that way in the plans. So.
But I think that's a good point, right? Of like, if we all have, you brought this up a couple minutes ago, right? We all have some examples of things that we think, okay, that we could allow for, I think, a really productive discussion, right? You're saying, hey, there's this
Yeah, I'm
property
just-
that we keep referencing, like, what are the things about that? Let's talk about that, and maybe that will allow
Yeah, I
us
kind of
to-
like specificity and
Exactly.
versus,
as opposed to like, build living space into a setback, okay? You know, but
or as an example, on
Yeah.
that house, you know, which I think, and so now we've brought height into the discussion. I mean, it's tall because of the slope of the house. So if, you know, if you had that same exact structure and those overhangs were 2 feet rather than 4 feet, would that make it be less imposing to the
Exactly.
neighbor or not? You know,
Exactly.
I'm not sure it would have that big of an impact, but the neighbor could tell me I'm wrong about that, because I have 2 small houses next to me. Anyway, that's just kind of my thought is, you know, people worry about imposing houses. You know, is that more about height? Is it more about this? Is it both? You know, we have some that think 4 feet's a good number. Obviously, some think that that's imposing on that house. So I just, I keep coming back to, I sure would like to have a lot more specific citizen input, which is always very difficult to come by in our city.
Well, I mean, where do we go from here? Do we pass on to city council that, you know, there's some things we have consensus on here, There are other things, there may be a difference of opinion, like how much should an overhang be? You know, Dave says he'd like to see 4 feet, other people may say 2. So what kind of guidance is the council looking for from us right now, Sarah?
Well, I think because this has to come back for a public hearing anyway, that I think it's more just talk amongst yourself and kind of get your head around some of the things that need to be considered, because then there will be input at the next P&Z meeting where you have citizen comments, and so I don't think I really think it would not be appropriate for you to come up with a conclusion tonight, because you need to be open to take, you know, any input that you get at the public hearing
Right.
into consideration, so.
Right.
That's a good point, and I guess that's a question is, should we have discussion amongst ourselves now about, okay, if we isolate it to overhangs, about what our individual general thoughts are at the moment about what those numbers are, or should we say, let's all be thinking about that to be prepared to have our specific thoughts on that at the next meeting? Is it inappropriate to talk about that specifically now? Do we think that's a good idea?
Well, I don't think it's not, I wouldn't say it's inappropriate to talk about it.
I just don't want citizens to come in thinking, well, they all talked about it and made up their minds.
I mean, they all could, you know, walk in here and sit and listen if they wanted to.
True.
You know, it's been properly posted.
That's a good point.
What I don't want us to do is reinvent the wheel over and over, you know, or retread ground we've already discussed. And so if we can distill what we have discussed, you know, this evening, which maybe staff can do, you know, in minutes of tonight. I mean, it seems to me there's a consensus that we need to do something, you know, we need to make sure that there are no cantilevers that extend living space, you know, that's fairly agreed among all of us. And we have a consensus on that if we're talking about a roof overhang, probably the consensus is between 2 and 4 feet, depending on who you talk to in the commission. So I don't know, in terms of, you know,
I think it's important, by
Yeah.
the way, that you delineated there, right, of overhang, like amount is one thing and overhang type is another thing.
right,
Right.
I'm trying to look at this to see what else has been brought up.
You know, in the discussion that, you know, that we received that talks about making changes to the code, there are examples that are provided from different parts of Texas, rock wall, and I don't know if it's Butte or something. But there's a number of things there, and they're good examples. And some of the examples have it such that whatever the overhang is, whatever the object is the same in every case. It might be 1 foot 6 inches, might be 2 feet. And in others, it is more specific as to what kind of an overhang we're talking about, you know. And what I would submit is that my preference is that I'd rather be more specific. Not just say, okay, let's just use the same brush and paint everything the same and say it's got a 2 foot overhang, that's allowed, and nothing else is. I think it should be designed to purpose.
I will throw one other thing that I have just thought of as y'all were talking that could be considered is a difference in taking the height into consideration. You know, there's a difference between how imposing it is if you have a 4-foot overhang on a 1-story house versus if you have it on a 2-story house, and how far that would cause runoff to travel. You know, it's not gonna go near as far coming off a 1-story house as it is a 2-story house, and if you're on the 10-foot setback side, you know, how is that gonna impact your neighbors? And so that's something that could be considered. And in addition to just the eaves, one other thing that I have noticed that I think needs to be considered is mechanical equipment, because we don't have anything right now that limits how far or how close to the property line that can be installed. So if you have your air conditioning equipment on the 10-foot setback side of the house that's getting really close to your neighbor. And swimming pool, if you build that all the way to the 20-foot setback and then you put all the pool equipment behind that, then that's, you know, going to be affecting your neighbor more than it is whoever's property is, that equipment is serving. So that, I think that's something that needs to be considered in addition to just the eaves and the living space.
I'm wondering, you know, with the public input, how does the public consider all these things? That's a lot of stuff, what you just said. It's good, I mean, you know, it's good discussion, but it's a lot of stuff. So how does the public say, okay, don't forget to include, you know, HVAC installations and how that works, and don't forget to think about, you know, what the runoff angle is gonna be on a particular thing. You know, how does this, what's the mechanics of this? How do we collect this
I guess, and
information?
we've had
You know?
I mean, we've had pools and
Yeah.
HVACs and all that for many years, and we've had these setbacks for many years. I
Yeah.
guess what's different about that now than it's ever been?
Yeah.
Well-
They make less noise than they used to,
So that's why you get public input.
yeah.
You know, if you people come in and say, you know, I have that right next door to me and it's causing me all these issues, or I have that next door to me and I don't even notice it, you know, so you get, the difference is that the homes that are going in are much bigger than they were before we had sewer, when we had to have a drain field. And we have not updated our building code to take into account that huge difference in how the properties can be used and how they can be developed.
I agree
I
to a
think one of
certain
the things you were
extent, yeah.
saying too was like, what is the best mechanism for soliciting public input? Is that
That's
kind of,
it.
and like, and
Yeah.
I don't,
Thank you.
like, I'm thinking that like, well, gosh, can't we take all this and put it in some nice, simple layman's term document and have everybody read that? But then you could miss something like, I'm not sure if there's any way to get around the public reading the code. I don't know. Is there a way to boil this into
Well,
something?
what was talked
you
about at
know?
the last meeting was, you know, we had this huge initiative that was, I think, you know, very successful on the commercial corridor with a
Yeah.
citizen task force and
Yeah.
rewrite, and, I mean, month-long
And
process, I
a
think,
survey.
you know, yeah, survey.
Comprehensive plan thing.
And it got, I mean, I think as good a feedback from citizens as anything has since I've been here. And, you know, I think on the residential side, I think, you know, it's a big undertaking. I don't know exactly when it is or how it gets done, but I think that's something that,
I mean, I would
is
think
warranted.
this is a big enough issue that
Yeah.
would warrant something. Like
and we've
that.
got a
I mean,
blueprint for it with the commercial one to replicate a lot of the same processes. And then the question is, do we have Band-Aid things that
Right,
we do
that's the
before
issue.
that, yeah. And that's the only thing I'd hesitate with, you know, if we're bringing more things up. I think all those are great discussion points for a comprehensive plan, I guess. What do we want to stay focused on? What does city council want us to stay focused on right now?
Well,
You know,
let's,
my understanding is the overhangs.
well, let's say hypothetically, if all of us as citizens of Rollingwood discovered that an older home next door to us, or one on the other side, had just been sold and was about to be torn down, what would you want to see, you know, as a citizen with, you know, with what's gonna replace it? And I think, to Sarah's point, because we have not updated our code since we put in sewer, or not adequately updated our code since we put in sewer, I mean, many of us, myself included, now see these things that are right to the setback lines, right to the height restrictions, no room for error whatsoever, you know, in terms of how they're building. And we went over and measured one next door to our neighbors because we were convinced it had a 9-foot setback and not a 10-foot one. And we measured it and it was 9. But, you know, somebody from City Hall came down and said, no, it was 10. So but that's how close people are cutting it right now. And so I would love to see the citizen committees and the rewrites, but I think what we're being asked to do tonight is to say what kind of Band-Aids can we put on this that we're comfortable with. or at least, give guidance to city council. And then obviously we're gonna have to have a public hearing when we have an actual amendment to the
There was a
code.
suggestion, I guess, a few minutes ago about how to handle that, and I didn't quite fully get it. You said, could you say that again, or,
Sure. Yeah. So what I said was my interpretation of the original meeting at city council was that there was an issue with overhangs, specifically in that they extended too far into the setbacks, specifically as related to that Park Hills house, and that Brooke Brown had received citizen input that they wanted the city council to pass code changes to prevent that from happening going forward. Because the state law prevents the city from being retroactive, right? So any permits that are currently have been sent into the city, the existing law applies. So initially when I heard that, I thought, well, that would be an easy fix to just add to the code, the existing code as it's fully written, protrusions into the setbacks, like permitted protrusions may not extend for greater than X feet, whether that's 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet, whatever. Instead, there was this rewrite of the yard and setback provision that kind of made a lot of language changes that, in my opinion, hasn't been fully vetted with other provisions of the code and not really fully thought through, so creates additional confusion. So instead of introducing all of that new language, why not just keep the code as it currently is and say, as it relates to permitted protrusions into the yards, those are limited to a certain number of feet.
Okay. I don't disagree with that. But still, I guess we're still seeking public input on what those limitations are gonna be.
Well, that, and when we say protrusions, is that global? I mean, is that anything of any kind that could protrude?
And I might submit that there could be two answers to that. One would be on a Band-Aid, maybe yes. On a code rewrite, maybe no, or I would say no.
And if we were to put something like, have some direction like that, we would do our best to vet as much as possible that section of the code and any kind of possible unintended consequences. So we would hopefully, be able to run that through and get some language that would be, good to do what you're wanting to do. And then as far as the citizen, the citizen process and getting them in here for the next public hearing or whenever that is, I think, we can bring options, and there's always times at that public hearing for the P&Z to say, here's the options in front of us. We've just heard XYZ and we want to incorporate that into this. And there are certain things like that I think could be made on the fly, right? We could say, okay, and then that could be how it goes on to city council is, we agree with this modification, and that's for them to vote on as well. So the buck doesn't stop here. There is ultimately one more place for it to be vetted and have another public hearing. So,
Well, do we have anything more we want to discuss on this tonight, or does everybody feel we've kind of thoroughly explored the options here?
At least as far as the overhang business goes, I think so. We haven't talked about it, building height yet, not really.
No, I was gonna mention
That's
one,
different.
maybe we should go to building
Yeah.
height. I was gonna mention one other thought that occurred to me while we were talking about protrusions too, is one thing we could think about is whether we would wanna have cause Sarah's point about, 4 feet on a 10-foot side is, not insignificant. Would we give any thought to whichever side of your house you choose to be 15 or 10, you have a different measure on the 15-foot side versus the 10-foot side.
Yeah, you could also express it as some sort of percentage, I don't know, or something like that.
Particularly if, your concern is, sunlight and efficiency.
Right.
Then if that's somebody's primary concern, could you orient your setback such that, the sun is coming in from this side, I'm gonna put the 15-foot setback on that side so I can get whatever the number is.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
larger on that one versus the other.
Yeah, I'll just say the obvious, or I think I'm repeating myself at this point, like I think some Band-Aids are important, but I do think this is an incredibly weighty topic that should be treated the same as we treated the commercial zoning piece. And I would be all for doing a really big effort to do a full survey of the populace like we did for the commercial thing.
Sure.
I think this is important enough to warrant that.
Well, I
agree.
yeah. I think my feeling is, it could take a couple of years
Yeah.
before we get there, and in the meanwhile, we could have some things being built that are gonna really, alter the character of Rollingwood in ways we may not wanna see.
That's right.
And so, you know, I think all the comments have been really good tonight. Thank you for coming. And thank you, Sarah, as always, for being here. Are we gonna be talking about height tonight, or are we really just talking about extensions into setbacks?
So,
Heights on the agenda.
Yeah,
It is
height
on
is
the
the
agenda,
next.
so we,
and if you wanted to bring that up and talk at that at the same time, and then kind of at the end, we could recap, you know, here's what staff heard and here's what we'll go back and work on. So currently what we are hearing from the setbacks is kind of a temporary solution to limit permitted projections. Somewhere it looks like between 2 to 4 feet, and we can bring that back, and that can be something that is spoken on at the public hearing, and
okay, and
input
then
can be sought.
on height, are we ready to move on to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that summary, Ashley, that you just said, captures what we've talked about.
Yeah, and, you know, again, I mean, with height limitations, the reason we're discussing this is because, you know, there is a sense from residents, and I've heard some fairly outraged comments about some buildings that have gone up. I won't refer to a specific building, but, that we, you know, if we have, structures that are on a slope, you know, how are we going to address that going forward? And, is there anything new, Ashley, that you wanna bring up that wasn't discussed at the joint meeting?
Not necessarily. I think on the height limit, I think what we're kind of aiming to get some information on here is, you know, how tall do we actually want them to be, right? There needs to be some kind of idea, basically, and then how do we want to measure that? We do have these topographic changes on lots, and so with the current way it is, it kind of allows for, you know, it higher extent of topography changes, and that kind of determines how tall your building gets to be, you know, into the space. But just any ideas or thoughts on how we might prefer to measure those, or if there are any changes that need to be made. And then I guess other than that, there's also been a lot of talks of additional inspection requirements and things to find out along the way, you know, how things are measuring up to code. And I think those are very relevant. I don't think they're necessarily relevant in the zoning code. They're probably more of a building code part, or a building process, kind of more our inspections process. So I think that's something that we'd like to keep that discussion going, but maybe not a zoning specific change right now.
I guess one concern I have is where people or builders may be artificially manipulating the slope, you know, in order to get a taller structure. You know, I think there's been a sense of
Right.
concern about that.
Yeah, and I do think there might be some room for kind of ambiguity on finished grade versus, you know, original grade on a property. And that also, though, after we spoke a little bit to get some planning advice on this one, some of that might also have to be handled outside of the zoning chapter as well, though definitely great to discuss here. It might be more of a drainage or a site disturbance section, which maybe wouldn't fall under zoning, but I think it gives us some really good ideas from this discussion how we might want to make updates
Does
there.
it have to take grade into account? Is there any reason why it has to be based on grade? Why can't it just be on, you know, livable floor space, you know, base floor space versus the top of the house. You got a 35-foot requirement, you can't go over that, regardless of what the grade is around it.
I think codes probably do it, you know, all sorts of different ways. You
Yeah.
could say, you know, the tallest wall can be X feet, or, you know, the highest wall, or the way it does it now is it tries to kind of take those topographic changes into account, but that's not necessarily how it has to be done. So,
And a second thing, when the K-Freeze people were here, you know, a couple of weeks ago, there's not much, or there's no real validation being done as to whether or not what's being built is actually 35 feet from where they said that it was gonna be. And some of the things that you look at, I'm sure it's more than 35 feet. I mean, I don't,
Well, I think they
have
said
the
they
orig- I don't
measure
have the site
framing, but
plan.
they're not
I
measuring
don't have the
with
site plan,
specificity.
you know, but when you look at what it is, 35 feet, you know, you can kinda judge that. I mean, it's not that hard to come up with, and some of these things just look like they're taller than that, and
Right.
nobody's checking.
Well, they are, yeah.
Right, yeah, and
They
we-
are
yeah.
because of the slope. So
Right.
Yeah.
if it slopes from back to front, the front of the house can absolutely be more than 35 feet, and often is, yeah.
and currently it's based off of, you know, the original surveys have, you know, sea level points, and those are what are used, but you're absolutely right. If it's sloping forward, you could absolutely have, you know, potentially 4 stories, more than 35 feet, and it would still meet our calculations for that height limit, so.
I think this one's tricky just in the fact that there, I mean, unless I'm misunderstanding, there is an established, that's at least been going on since I've been here, interpretation of height that does take into account slope. So I think that's one question, is do we want to change that? And then 2 is if the answer is no, we don't want to change that, or we're not going to change it yet, is there some sort of manipulation that's happening that's wasn't the intent originally of factoring in slope, so that, you know, a lot that has significant slope is not penalized in that they can't build as much as a flat lot. And I was not very clear. I'd be interested certainly to hear more from the engineers. I didn't totally follow exactly what that gaming entailed, and how it can be prevented or measured or some of that.
Well, one comment was that what the original datum was might have changed because of the grade changed in the building of the house. And so they can't necessarily check it because what was proposed originally is not the same as what it is.
And that's what I have a hard time with, yeah.
As built is not the same. And it seems to me it all ought to be done based on a grading plan, whatever the original lot plan was supposed to be, or the building plan, that should be what the datum is.
Yeah, and that's where I would want more engineer feedback, because my only experience with it is design a house that I didn't ultimately build, at least yet, but, and it's on a sloped lot. So my understanding there is specific data there in the measurement, and I guess what I don't understand is how does that not translate to what's ultimately built? And, because it can't go just change plans. So in other words, if it says this is gonna be this height in the front because of the grade, whatever, and we agree on that and it's approved, you know, are we saying that becomes, say it was 45 feet in the front because of the slope, that's now as built become 50 feet? You know, they built something that wasn't drawn. That's what I don't really understand.
And I think we've come to a little bit more clarity on that datum point, and so with the most recent, you know, we sent out for a height inspection, and those points were resurveyed, those original datum points. So what they'll do is they'll go out and get a survey of the lot as is, which first off is also always a snapshot in time, because dirt changes, you know, wind can change it, the rain can change the topography a lot, and so it's not always necessarily going to be exact from one day to the other. But what it is, it's a snapshot in time. And then there's a calculation based on the highest point on the lot and the lowest point. And if the lowest point is more than 10 feet further, you use the lowest point plus 10 feet, and then that's where your 35 feet start. But I don't believe the intent of the code is to allow any grading after that point, to where you could then take advantage of that, the height limit, and change it there. However, grading happens when they do foundations. I mean, almost always immediately that point is disturbed when they go in to do the foundation.
But there's, the original survey that's taken takes into account the the as-is topography and at 2-foot contours, according to code. And then what the design of the house should be based on is the site plan. That is, what will the grade look like after the house or while the house is being built? How will this topography change? And that should be the basis of anything. What you intend to do, not what it is today, what you intend to do. Which unfortunately is difficult to monitor.
Right. Well, it could also be potentially manipulated too. If you intend to add 5 feet of dirt, you could potentially get your, you know, so
Yeah.
almost either way you run into.
Well, these things should all have elevations on them. But to simplify it, I'd say using a base floor, you know, using the actual structure itself as your measure just kind of steps away from the grade. And you have a box and it's allowed to be 35 feet tall. That's it. The box is allowed to be 35. That's it. No matter what the box is.
But how high is the foundation?
Well,
That's where the part of the issue comes from, is that some of these homes on significant slopes are being built where the front foundation, or the back, whatever, depending on where the slope is. But if you go 35 feet from the top of the foundation, but the foundation is 10 feet tall, then you're 45 feet.
But is that not factored into the allowable
yeah.
height?
It
I mean,
is. So I don't know if you're talking about my house, Sarah, but
I'm
Okay.
not talking about your house.
on Vale Street, my lot goes like this.
Mhm.
The front is right here. And we had extensive conversations with our architect about how the code works. And I think the issue with the code is that the way people are getting around it is you're not taking the survey, the topographical datum feet from sea level at the point pre-construction. So what we did is we had a topographical survey done of our house that was there, and it said, based on the code, let's just say 5 feet from the structure that we're building, 660 feet above sea level. Then we had more than 10 feet of slope on our lot. So you use that 10-foot calculation, and that's where you come up with your base for where your 35 feet can go above. Based on your topographical survey with your site plan, we know that the top of our house is like 635 feet above sea level. That's the highest it can be. It doesn't matter. Obviously, we're gonna have to dig up our whole yard when we're doing all of our drainage tanks and the drainage plan and the foundation and everything. And if you drive by my lot right now, it looks like from the front, my foundation is 10 feet tall. The finished floor level of the first floor of my house is exactly the same as the house that was there before. It's just pulled forward. And so when my house is constructed, in my opinion, it will be easy to determine whether or not my house is within the building height requirement of the code by saying how many feet above sea level is the top of my roof with the chimney. Period. We'll say, 635 feet above sea level. That's what they had in their plans. The surveyor does that. Like, that's how it's determined. I think if you do a code change purely based on finished floor or, base floor elevation, then you're going to be putting so many homes in Rollingwood into non-conforming structure basis. And you're also going to be devaluing lots with slopes, in my opinion. That I think the current code works just with tweaks to where the original reference datum point and how it's determined. And I think it could easily be determined by requiring a topographical survey and then measuring based on that.
so is expanding on that is one reason, and I agree, there are a lot of houses with large foundations, but is that less about building height and more about how the lot has been graded afterwards? In other words, if it was sloped up here and now they've, you know, and you got all your measurements are there, but now they've removed all this dirt to have a flat yard, which has created the appearance of a taller structure and foundation?
Oh, yeah, potentially. I mean, our house specifically, and I would presume a lot of the other homes, the height is determined obviously based pre-construction on the existing topography of the lot. If you go into ours now, yes, they've had to take out a bunch of dirt. They're gonna build it back up afterward, but whatever they do as it relates to building dirt around our foundation, it doesn't really matter. It's not gonna change how tall our structure can actually be. I think,
But it can make it look taller depending on how the final landscaping
Exactly.
plan is done.
yeah, but the original height is based on the original topography of the site. I think, I mean, going through our building process, I think there was confusion at the city level in how they were interpreting the code, and maybe some of the homes benefited from that. Our architect interpreted it differently than a friend's architect, and so I do think that there is room for improvement there.
So if I understand you right, what you're saying is that, okay, you're at 10 foot above, you have a slope that allows for 10 feet in front, and you're now building to that. It will be at the same datum level. The first floor will be at the same level as the first floor of the house that used to be there.
Correct, exact
Okay.
same finish
But
floor.
you could have cut 10 feet out, and then you would still build it 45 feet tall, and you would still get the same result. You would now be 10 feet over, or you'd be still 35 feet above what the original topography allowed. But
Well,
if you change that topography, now you can add another 10 feet.
but you can't change it, that's the thing. The topography is the original native ground cover,
Yeah.
and I think what people are doing is the city of Rollingwood is not requiring a topographical survey of the existing property, like pre-disturbance.
Sure they do.
I believe.
But they don't, you actually went to elevations. Whenever we did our house, they assigned 200 feet as the lowest point. It's not true, it's not really 200 feet, but they're saying, okay, let's call it 200 feet. And then everything else is gonna be 4 feet, 204, 206, and it'll be like that. Everybody understood that 200 was just a number that pulled out of the air. You're more precise, not more accurate, but more precise in your measurement in that you're using a real earth datum, so a real earth elevation. Okay, now, you still could bore into that if you wanted to and change that topography in the building process and end up at the same height as you are, and you would have more than 35 feet. You could do it.
That's right. If I wanted to, there's basically a tent. It's a tent rule, right?
Sure.
35 feet from a base datum point,
Right.
as determined by the original native ground cover.
Sure.
If you have a sloped lot and you don't go above that tent, you
Yeah.
can build a basement.
Yeah.
You can build, if it's subterranean, an additional level, but you could also do that on any other lot if you wanted to dig down.
So is there I need to read this again, I can't remember now. Is there just a maximum, so there's the 10-foot adjustment. Does it effectively create a max height of any one side of the building regardless of slope?
It does not. It's just the 35 feet from that calculation. There is no one wall cannot be, or one side cannot be
So,
taller
Because
than.
To
you
Dave's
can build
point,
down,
you have
too.
slope like this, you know, whatever, your floor, you know, your base building elevation is here. You could go dig 20 feet down and put a sunken yard or whatever and have a 60-foot or, you know, however
Right.
far you're
You-
willing to dig.
You could, there are other areas of the code that govern how far you can cut into drainage section, so you can only cut X amount, you know, per.
And obviously
don't-
still
you
gotta
know,
meet all the drainage.
Sure,
and-
all other requirements. So you couldn't. I mean, I don't think you can cut 20 feet out and make a whole, you know, 2 more stories, but you could, within the bounds of the code, do that.
My suggestion would be that you all talk to an architect or someone who's well versed in interpretation of the code, application of the code, and then have that person give suggestions as to how to make it more clear so that whatever you all decide the actual interpretation should be, the code actually says that. I personally am against putting newly constructed homes into the non-conforming structure category. I think that causes a lot of issues, and I know my neighbors would be against that as well. But I do think that this height provision in the code seems to cause a lot of confusion, but I think you should talk to an expert in the area who can advise you all as to what y'all should do.
I guess I'd question as to why what does a height provision intend to do? What's it for? And is specifying it at 35 feet the best way to do it? As opposed to what the surrounding architecture is around, or whatever.
You should,
Because, you know, it's really kind of an arbitrary number, it's a number. And, you know, this 35 feet looks different from this 35 feet because of the topography, right? And really what you're trying, I don't know, I think what's trying to happen is you're trying to get some kind of homogeneity across the whole top surface and keep it all from being overbearing, I guess. Or is it? I mean, you know, it would be nice if the code actually said, the code is trying to do this. This is what our intention is, you know, and this is how we're gonna do that. We're gonna use 35 feet, we're gonna plug it in here, and we're gonna use that.
I think that you all could look at the City of Austin code. I think they refer to theirs as a tent rule, and I think it's a lot more simple than the Rollingwood City Code.
I've seen some pretty weird stuff come out of the city of Austin as far as heights.
I think there's
and
been a
like
lot
that.
of unintended consequences.
Yeah,
of
there's
that
a
tent
huge,
rule.
Yeah.
you're practicing law in that area, is that correct? And
No,
I guess
I'm a
you-
commercial real estate attorney.
Oh,
I don't
okay,
do
yeah,
residential.
yeah, well, get a good look at the McMansion rule, it's a dandy. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in that, and you have to be, well, you have to know your arithmetic pretty well in order to figure it out.
Yeah, I have to go, but my only suggestion, I urge you all to talk to someone who's knowledgeable in interpretation, application of our current code to fully understand how it works, and then figure out changes before just implementing Band-Aids.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know the full intention of the code. It hasn't spoken to me either, but I know an intention was of this wonky measurement was to try to allow for lots of varying slope to have some semblance of equal treatment. Whether it's done that effectively or not, you know, it's a whole nother debate, but I think that was one of the intentions.
I think that's fair, right? And that's kind of what's behind the comment of devaluing sloped lots. If you did have some uniformity and you can't be this much above, right, a higher sloped lot would therefore be penalized significantly by that, but, yeah.
I think one thing to be aware of is kind of the history of the height limitations. So I'm sure Amy remembers this too. When we moved into Rollingwood, the height limit was 30 feet. At some point, it was changed to 35 feet.
I don't remember when or how that happened, do you?
I do not. It was
I think
before
I think
my
Brooke said
time.
it was with the advent of the International Building
So
Standards.
I think
maybe?
that she said that like 1985 or something. But there is a part of the code now that says no part of a building may be more than 35 feet tall. A lot of the original homes in Rollingwood are split level homes. So they took into account the elevation change by building split level homes. So instead of starting your instead of having a flat foundation across the whole building area, they had multiple foundations, right? So that you have multiple levels, which then allows you to have the same space without having quite the same imposing structure by having the very high foundation and then building on top of that. So there's been some differences, and also without the need for the drain field, a larger area of the lots are being built on, which then means that it is being built across a greater topographic change than what we've had previously, right? Because there's, you know, a longer distance that you are building across, and so there's more change in the elevation that then changes the look of the home based on how you are doing the calculations of the, you know, the 35 feet, and from what point are you measuring that? So.
From a city council perspective, is 35 feet a good way to do this, or is it homogeneity? You know,
But I don't think it's homogeneous, and
Yeah.
you know, I don't know where this came from to start with. My understanding, and I think the way a lot of people always looked at it, was that Rollingwood didn't allow 3 stories. You know, the homes were allowed to be 2 stories. And so 35 feet allowed you to have, you know, instead of 30 feet, people were going, well, we want to put in, you know, not an 8-foot ceiling, but a 10-foot or a 12-foot ceiling, you know, so that allowed the ceiling height to be higher within those 2 stories. But now, instead of having just 2 stories, now we're getting people with 3 stories, and some places where you're counting 4 stories, if they are, especially where they're digging down and putting in something that's, you know, sort of below grade. And then all of a sudden you have a, you know, 4 stories stacked on top of each other. And so that's really changing the feel. And it's not a homogeneity, it's that if you have somebody at the low part of the hill and a home gets built here, and then they get to add, you have something looming over you. So it's to try and also keep, I think what we need to also consider is not making the neighbors feel dwarfed by what is being put in around them, right? So we're trying to take into account I mean, like Tony said, you've got 2, you know, older, low homes next to you, but now,
It won't always be that way.
yeah, right, now you do, but you're also on a flat, you know, part of the city, and so you likely wouldn't have the same impact from somebody
What's
building a new
interesting,
home.
if they were doing the measurement correctly, and I don't fully understand the measurement or whether they're doing it correctly, but if they were doing it correctly, you wouldn't be able to extend, like you're talking about, make it more imposing on a neighbor than it otherwise would be. If you're starting from a certain elevation that is consistent with the existing structure, and you can only go 35 feet from there, then it shouldn't matter how much you dig out or any of that. The height of the building should be the same. So if this house is here and there, and you're building 35 feet from where the other one was, it's not going to be any more or less imposing. I mean, maybe imposing because 35 feet
Well,
is.
if it was a 1-story house before, and so it
Well,
was.
I mean, that cat's out of the bag on that, right? You
Right,
can build
if it was a
35 feet, I
1-story
mean,
house before, and you're coming closer to the street or closer to the setback than it was before, then it absolutely could be more imposing, because you're taking away this empty space that you had between homes, and you're filling it with.
I remember from past discussion, there's a lot of old homes that are over the setback right now that have to be moved back. Now they're 1 story, so it's not imposing, but, you know, we've had the same setbacks for a long time. I don't know. I think I look at some houses and I don't understand how they look so tall. Now, whether they are any taller than they could have been if they were built 35 feet and the grade hadn't changed as much. So again, are they more imposing than they otherwise could have been? I don't know the answer to that. Certainly there's some of them I don't like the aesthetic very much, but I think that's a question. Are we talking about aesthetics of the front of a house, and you know, if that's 4 feet or 4 stories or whatever it is, or are we talking about the relative height to neighbors, Or are we talking about both of those things?
I have another question that is really kind of part of the same discussion. I know the first time I looked at the code was 2015. And back then, there was a requirement, you weren't allowed to have a flat roof. The roof had to have pitch. That was part of the code. It's not there anymore. It, I think, still is part of the code for commercial, but it is not in the residential code. And what changed?
When was that you said?
It used to be
How
that
long
a
ago?
roof had to have pitch. A new roof had to have pitch.
Like,
You
was that a
couldn't-
couple years ago
you
or
weren't
10
al-
years ago?
Back
or-
2015, you weren't allowed to build a flat roof.
Hmm.
I know this because we had tried to architect, and then we compared it to what the code said, and we said, well, we're not allowed to do that, so we'll have a pitched roof.
I wish Brian Nash was here. He has a flat roof, and I thought he was built before then. But
Well, there actually are a couple of houses that do have flat roofs. I think on Ryan, one of the ones that come up to the Rosewood Drive, that do have flat roofs, and they were built right around that time, and we wondered, how can that be? Because we know that's not code. But,
Well,
but what happened? Something happened there.
Yeah, we're getting on toward 8 o'clock,
Yeah.
and so, I know there are a lot of things we could all talk about, but do we have anything more on the issues that staff have brought to us tonight? I mean, other than,
Amy, the only reason I bring this
Yeah.
up, because whenever you want to talk about imposing, a pitched roof has less imposition on the place next to it than a flat roof does. And that's all. I just
yeah,
wanted to.
I don't know
okay,
though that
so-
anybody's saying we need to go
Yeah,
back and have
right.
pitched roofs,
Yeah.
so, but obviously there are structures with flat roofs, that have possibly taken advantage lately. But we are getting on toward 8 o'clock, I know everybody starts to fade after a little while. Do we have anything else that we wanna talk about on these issues? I think staff have probably, heard quite a bit in terms of what they can take back to the drawing board. And let's see, do we have anything else on?
I think staff would just like maybe some clarity on what is to be brought back. I guess we're a little more clear maybe on yards at this point, as far as height goes, and then also if these are ready for the public hearing process. So and we do want to know and make sure we're sure when we do that, because it is an extensive notice process and extensive and expensive. So just want to make sure that if we notice it, we're ready. That doesn't necessarily mean that action has to be taken right away, or that, there can't be a, we recommend this but aren't sure about this, and that goes on to city council for further discussion. And so if there's any more maybe clear direction on what we would be bringing back for height, we are happy to craft something for review and public hearing next month if we think it's ready for that.
I would say I've probably been the least vocal in this, although I think it's a super important topic. Sarah, you said something that I thought resonated, which is just an absolute cap on the number of levels of a house. And I don't know, is that problematic? Like, it's like Rollingwood used to not have 3-story homes, right? And obviously, I don't know if you say that you can't have X stories, whatever that number may be, is something that would need to be explored. But I'm just wondering, is that open it up to other problems? I don't know. I'm not presenting a solution here. I'm just wondering, like, it feels like with being able to like dig out a certain amount of ground, and then you have this kind of like 10 foot of wiggle room. There's just and like 10 feet's like a ton, and like and then there's just like cross thing into like the potential drainage rules. It feels like this is a really complex thing of which there is just inevitably going to be workarounds or ways that somebody creative is going to be able to game it. And I'm just wondering, do you instead try to put some sort of just like absolute cap to somehow prevent a 50-story or 50-foot tall structure going in because of some 10-foot wiggle room and some crazy slope that allowed for it? I don't know. I'm not coming with.
yeah, and that's the parts I don't really
like
still have a good handle on is
Well,
what
yeah.
can be done right now.
Exactly.
And that this is probably not something staff could do, and I don't know if engineers could do, but I would be interested if if we all drove around and said, okay, that house has a really big foundation, it feels really tall.
Right.
Give me the background on that. How did that come to be? Is it 35 foot from this point? Did they create another 15 feet by doing some monkey business, or, you know, basically if you had 4 or 5 of them, you know, that you pick out and say, here's a case study, you know, a summary of how this one came to be. So I think I have a hard time coming in and making changes to building height if I don't feel confident that I understand how building height is currently.
I'm not an
Yeah.
engineer, you
No.
know, and I don't know, I mean, you may be an engineer, Sarah, you know, but, I don't know how many engineers we have on this commission.
We have Mike, but he's not here.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm not comfortable saying we should do X or we should do Y. I think, is it Kendra that's her name, or Kendall?
Kendra.
I mean, I think certainly talking to experts is always a good idea. I don't know, if we have some, I thought I looked through the packet, maybe you had something in there about, you know, ordinances in other jurisdictions having to do with height. And so maybe we all need to just study that a little bit more, and like, you know, like Tony was saying, maybe, you know, we look at what's causing a problem in the city right now. You know, where are the problems? What are causing, you know, where are the problems being caused? And how do we ensure that in the future going forward, we don't have, you know, these kinds of issues. I know we still have one more thing on the agenda, so does anybody have anything more on, I mean, I know we could talk about it probably all night long.
Yeah, I think
Does
my thought
anybody-
for the specific
any
question about
new
staff
thoughts?
guidance, my thought is, you know, the extension in the setbacks feels a lot easier. I would probably generally favor less of a rewrite, more of a Band-Aid, based, you know, and always easier said than done, but with some agreed upon distances, whether we have 2 different ones or a single one.
Okay.
On building height, for me, I don't feel like I'm remotely close to being in a position to take any action on any change of the code. That's my
It's
personal.
infinitely
Yeah.
more complicated.
It's much more complicated, yeah. And, I mean, that doesn't mean we shouldn't take it on, you know.
I wouldn't, I
because-
don't know what the bar is
Yeah.
for public discussion, but if it was, you know, if it's discussion of, you know, if we had a group of people saying, you know, is this something we should be, you know, do you feel like there's a problem right now that we should be addressing in the context of a comprehensive plan or otherwise?
Yeah. My son and my son-in-law are both architects, and I'll ask them what they think, but I think what they're gonna think is, I think the answer is gonna be, we'll do whatever the code says. And it doesn't become a matter of preference to them, but I will ask.
You know, Kendra's accurate. It sounds like, you know, you would have, you know, different opinions from equally qualified
Could be.
experts, and that's
Well,
obviously a problem.
That's the
Yeah,
problem.
that's a problem.
Is
So
where-
whether we're changing anything or just,
But if there was a simple answer, it would be
Yeah.
nice to hear it.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not an engineer, but I am a lawyer, and, you know, ambiguity in anything is always leads to, you know, litigation, you know, things like that. So, I think, do you all feel like we've pretty well explored the topic tonight? I think we can't, none of us feel comfortable saying how we would,
Sure.
you
Right,
know,
and I think
do
at
the height.
maybe at a you know, maximum today, what we could is maybe take a look at what it says and just see if there are things we can strengthen kind of as it is currently. But at the same time, it doesn't have to come back for public hearing, you know, right away. It can be something, I will need to kind of work with legal, because if it is, you know, if it is directed for review by city council, you know, y'all are able to vote up or down on something, but we do need something to vote up or down on to send on to them. And so, I guess maybe if there's, you know, some room for some discretion by staff there with what to bring back, or
If there was an epiphany by one of us on this topic and we wanted to share it, is it permissible to do that? Are we allowed to send notes to each other to say?
It would need
I
to
heard
come
this.
through
Comes
the
to
city,
city,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, you
Yeah.
have to be careful about
Yeah,
that.
that's the
Yeah.
question.
Sure.
That's the question.
Yeah,
There could be a
Even-
potential
Even if it's to
quorum.
everybody, it's just a blanket email that says, well, I talked to this guy and he says,
send it
I
through
think
the
send
city
it
or.
send it
Send it
here.
through the city?
Yes,
Just-
send it to me. That'd be great. Or Desiree, one of us.
okay, okay.
And then depending on quorum rules and stuff, we either bring it back to the next meeting
A month
to
at
discuss.
a time goes pretty fast, and I don't really feel like we're getting a whole lot done here.
Yeah.
And it would be nice if you
Sure.
could front load it a little bit.
Mhm.
at
Sure.
least.
Okay.
I would love if we could even have a height meeting and we'd have staff and maybe there's even just one case study
Yeah.
with diagrams
I think
and
it's a
plans.
great
idea.
and
That's a great idea.
Here's what's presented to the city, cause we don't, we don't review
Yeah, I was
proposed
thinking
plans.
if we could have,
Here's a proposed plan for, let's all look around and pick a house that looks
I mean,
suspect.
or have some experts present.
Yeah, and then
you
have
know,
city
and-
say, these are what the plans look like,
and this
engineer,
is,
architect.
I mean, I wanna know how other cities with this problem have dealt with it. You know, I wanna hear, I don't wanna reinvent the wheel if somebody's done 90% of the work already that we need to do.
I
I mean,
think
I
a
think
lot
this
of
in
other
the
cities
essence
have
of-
impervious cover restrictions too, which would somewhat deal with this, because
Yes,
if you try to
yes.
build something that's 4 stories, basically, even if you're on the side of a hill or whatever, and you're gonna probably have too many square feet for the lot or some other
I think
calculation.
you're thinking of FAR, right?
Yeah.
Which,
Mhm.
impervious coverage would be how much footprint, FAR is how much
Yeah,
structure.
I think that has been the essence of a lot of the citizen feedback. You talked about some of the Amy Patillo's email that we got before the last meeting. What Kendra was saying tonight, I think there's a common theme of like these are incredibly important things that we're talking about here
Right.
that impact every single one of us, and that we shouldn't be making rash decisions. I think that's a
Right.
common theme that we're hearing here, and yet at the same time, that every time we don't act, there could be another developer that
Yeah.
comes in and gains it. So we're in this rough situation, and meeting monthly is a problem. I think that, right, we need to figure out how to make educated, comprehensive decisions quickly, which is easier said than done, but, I mean,
Well, I like the idea of maybe some work sessions where we get some expert input. But one thing that Kendra said, and it concerned me just a little bit, and I've heard other people say it, and I think, I know Amy said it, but one was if we make these changes, we may put recently built homes into being non-compliant.
Yes.
Isn't that the point to a certain extent? I mean, if they're grandfathered, then they're grandfathered, but isn't that the point that they would be non-compliant? Because something happened that we feel is, altering the character of the city. People building, humongous houses, absolutely to the setback lines, to the height limits, on lots that when this place, obviously, when this place was developed, we had 2,000 square foot ranch houses, and now we're so close into Austin, downtown Austin, and there have been plenty of people who have built large homes that have done a great job, but we're now seeing these spec houses that are not quite, so attractive. And so, when we say, if we're gonna not put somebody out of compliance, aren't we wasting our time even talking about this?
I think it's a magnitude of how many you're putting out of compliance from my perspective. And I don't understand, that's what I'd be interested in too. I think maybe that's an insurance expert is, my concern with putting people out of compliance is not, that it's inconveniencing them or any of that. My concern is that there's a fire, they're not able to build back what they had built and they sue the city or, something along those
Well, but we
lines.
could probably address those issues, I would
In
think.
commercial, what
Yeah.
you have is when you're grandfathered, to build back, there's certain thresholds. You can't build back what was there previously, and you go out and buy commercial insurance that covers that. Building law and ordinance coverage. Building law and ordinance changes, you can't rebuild in a casualty what was there. We will compensate you for that. I'm not aware that that exists in residential, and maybe it does. I'm not an insurance person.
I don't know. I know probably my house is out of compliance if it burned down. You know, I couldn't rebuild what's
But
there
I think,
now.
the the difference is if you've built a 6,000 square foot house and it burns down tomorrow and the rules have changed and now you can only build a 4,000, you know, is that an issue? There's unintended consequences is my concern with it. And I'm not saying there are, but I don't know. If there
Well,
are.
I guess, you know, how often do people's homes burn down out here where we have that as opposed to if we're having spec homes being built that are,
It doesn't have to be burned
know.
down. It can be partially burned. If you burn a wall that we've made
well,
non-compliant, you have to move
usually I
that wall.
think, don't you have to be more than 50%,
Maybe so.
unusable before that kicks in? I don't know. Sarah, do you know the answer to that? Well,
But I agree with you.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, you can't make any changes to a certain extent without creating non-compliance.
Right.
I want to be measured about how much of that. And part of that comes from when I got on 5 years ago, the first number of meetings, there was a lot of concern about putting older homes out of compliance. So, you know, that was a big theme in a lot of those discussions. I don't even remember the context of it, but it kind of ingrained in me to be sensitive to that.
yeah, I mean, I just figured if my house burned down, I need to have enough insurance, I can build something else that would be, you know, functional for me. Well, it's all great discussion. We still have one more agenda item here, which is commercial zoning code updates. Do we want to address that tonight, or is this more long-term?
I don't think that's a 2-minute conversation
No,
to do right.
no.
So, and
I think I guess it was stated in the last meeting that there's been budget made available for us to go forward with these updates, but there's the comprehensive plan, you can cherry pick a few things out of it, but I don't know what work means. What is it? What are we supposed to do to it?
Well, I'm not one that likes to go on to the wee hours of the night with these meetings. I think people get exhausted and then their brains don't work, and it's better to have some interim meetings, you know, where people can feel refreshed and, you know, even maybe have some luncheon meetings or something like that. But, Sarah, you have a thought there?
I was just gonna say, Brooke was on the strike force when the comprehensive plan was done, and so she is very familiar with the commercial code, recommendations, and so that might be a good one to put off until she can be present at the meeting to
Well,
help.
She was here a few months ago. I don't remember who all was here, but she gave us some good insight into that, and asked us some questions to provide input on, which we did. And so maybe that was, some of that was
Yeah,
to come back.
well,
to
that's wise advice, because I think Brooke not being here tonight, you know, if the goal is for all of us to get as much input as possible from people with expertise, we're not getting a lot of that, and I personally would be fine with putting it off. How do you all feel?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that would be best.
Okay, we have a consensus.
Just to, can I quickly run back and clarify? So for items 5 and 6, it sounds like we have probably enough for sure on the yards to bring it back. I think from a fiscal perspective, it makes sense to keep both of these running. If we do the notice together, we have to do one notice to the whole city for this public hearing for this and for council. It sounds like we might have enough to bring back some options to P&Z on the height stuff potentially. That I guess in the end, you can always vote up or down. So we can always say, you know, we don't agree with those and send that on to council. And so I think it might be best to go ahead and get that
Sure.
public hearing scheduled for this in council, and then we'll bring back some stuff, and hopefully then we'll have some public input. If we do the public notice, the whole city should know that we're going to be having the public hearing.
Do we know, well, I think like, I wanna make sure we're allowed to help with that, right, and encourage people to show up to the public hearing.
Absolutely.
Right, and I think that this is such an incredibly important issue that
Mhm.
people should show up to it, all of us that live here.
Sure.
Do we have any idea at this point roughly when that would be?
So if we follow the meeting schedule, that would put the December 7th P and Z meeting as the public hearing for P and Z, and then we would notice at the same time, so we have to do a 30 days out notice, so we have to get that out, in a couple days here to get that mailed out. We'd also have to notice the city council meeting at which there'd be the same, a follow-up public hearing, so that would occur at their December 21st, is that what it is, city council meeting?
Okay,
And
so
so,
it's December 7th for P and Z and the 21st for city council, both of which would be open to public
yes.
participation.
And
Right.
one question I have, are obviously always open to public participation. Can you walk me through the difference between a public hearing and a normal meeting? And why there's different notices and what's different about being,
So
what's
state
being
law
accomplished?
requires public hearings for certain items that are coming before the Planning and Zoning Commission, and that is just to ensure that a record is made and that an opportunity is given for everybody to make their comments. And so we open and close the public hearing and keep that record for purposes of needing to use it in the future versus just public comments, which can be made. We're not necessarily, kind of that conversation earlier, tracking that or keeping track of that as a separate record. So when there are requirements for public hearings, there's typically notice requirements that are required to meet state law, and that's why we're doing
And
it.
the public hearing would be December 7th,
Right.
according to the current schedule that we're on.
Sure, with
Correct.
with the planning and
What,
zoning.
what we
Okay.
did tonight was not a public hearing.
Right.
It was much more informal.
Mhm.
I mean, obviously, if we'd had 30 people in here, we could not have been so informal in letting people speak. But given that we only had 2 people in the audience, we were able to do that.
Right, and when we do kind of, if we go ahead and notice, we do kind of tie our hands to some extent where that it would need to go to council next, so we would need a recommendation. Worst case, we could always, re-notice it, and so at least this way, there's a chance that we can get by with one notice, but I think, that's probably the best way is to keep these running concurrently.
So would it be these exact agenda items posted for public hearing?
Yes, it would just be public hearing, discussion, and possible action, and then we would, clearly state for the record, we're opening a public hearing and let anyone, from the city speak on the topic, and then you guys could deliberate, take into consideration, include it in your motion or not, however you wanted to take it forward, and then it would go to city council for the exact same process, so they would also have a public hearing before considering the changes.
Well, as a lot of citizens here, I've personally said to me, and I've heard them talk about more transparency and more of an opportunity to have input. I mean, what are you looking for here on December 7th, right? These are
Yeah,
incredibly
they have-
important issues.
They
So
have
I think it's
opportunity,
much,
they just don't show up.
right, exactly. So,
Well,
at
there's
some
a
point,
website with
For
all
sure.
of this on there.
And there's also all of us who live here and talk to people, and so I just thank you, that's helpful. I'm helped at least add some value in terms of trying to get more people to come here on December 7th and speak up about this. This is.
That's
really
one of the
important.
reasons why
Yeah,
I
mean,
thought that if we're talking about
that-
big residential zoning changes, that we need a big
yeah,
process. That's the only time I've seen full engagement was on that, really, since I've been
And that's
here.
probably the best
And
way to
maybe
do
on
it.
the city branding.
Everybody showing up here on December 7th and stating their opinion would be helpful,
Mhm.
but
Oh,
it would-
absolutely.
then you'd have to, I think a really formal effort around this stuff is warranted. Absolutely agree with that. So,
Well, and do we need any kind of, I'm assuming for the purpose of the minutes, just there being a consensus to pass item 7, we don't need a motion and a vote on that? I didn't think so.
I don't think so. I think we
All right.
bring that back for more discussion.
All right, do we have anything else that needs to be brought up before we adjourn?
Can I just make one comment?
Sure.
Whenever we had met last, I'd offered that I'd like to go through the code and just look for busts that, thing says something over here, says something different over here. Might need a definition for these terms and stuff like that. I started doing that. Should I continue, or am I just kidding myself? I've got time to do things like this sometimes.
Well, my
I'm fascinated
attitude
by the
is,
code, so.
the more information we get,
Yeah,
the better. I
All
mean,
right.
that's,
yeah, I'm taking notes on it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think you should lead the charge on the.
Okay, well, I'll do it. There's 80 pages of
I
107.
mean, I'm
So-
not offering to do it, so if you want to do
Yeah,
it,
I can do
please,
it.
I think that's great.
I'll catch what I can. Okay, that's it. My own
Oh,
comment.
thank you.
Okay.
Anything else before we adjourn? All right, then, we are adjourned at, 8:15.